presented by Keizo.
First impressions of Astlibra Vision can be a little rough. The game's appeal isn't immediately apparent, neither from the visuals or footage in general, which is why I wanted to talk a little bit about it and why I think the game is so special. Astlibra Revision is a 2D action RPG presented by Kaizo. As the name suggests, it is a revision of a game he developed with upgraded visuals and more content. For this video, I will be avoiding spoilers, I won't be talking in depth about the plot, and will try to avoid showing off locations, weapons, and abilities from further into the game. That said, a couple of clips used will be from at least a few hours into the game. Everyone is going to have their own tolerance for spoilers, and I am trying to be considerate of that, but if footage past the tutorial area is a no-go, then this might not be the video for you. The game begins with our nameless, faceless, voiceless protagonist as a child. His hometown is attacked by demons and he is knocked unconscious. When he wakes up, his best friend is missing, and he seems to be in a world without other humans. He befriends a talking crow named Karen, and eventually the two embark on an adventure for the main character to reunite with his childhood friend, joining a guild in a major settlement with a simple agreement. Do the odd job for the guild and they'll help find his hometown. Just for some more clarification, this is a recommendation, not a review. It's very similar, but it's not exactly how I would approach a review for this game. I'm more aiming to shine a spotlight on a game I think deserves the attention, and despite overwhelmingly positive reception, doesn't have as much buzz as I think that it deserves. I imagine a big part of the game being overlooked is the visual style. It was certainly a bit off-putting for me as well. Less the technical aspect of the graphics and more that the game might be mistaken for a Flash game from 2009. I had almost overlooked the game because the surface impressions of it were so poor. The game did catch my interest when I saw how positive the reception around it was anyway, so I decided to try the demo out. I'm glad that I did, because I was hooked shortly after starting the game up until the credits were rolling on the game's final ending. In very simple terms, I think the game does everything it sets out to do extremely well, but Astlibra is greater than the sum of its parts. High praise when those parts already function so well on their own, but still, I think there's something a little more. The operative word being soul. Now, I know, it's a buzzword that doesn't really mean anything. We're gonna circle back to this before we wrap up, but for now, let's talk about something a little more concrete. Gameplay-wise, Astlibra can best be described as an action game. The game again is an ARPG that comes with the standard affair of leveling up and increasing stats. Despite hosting an impressive number of growth mechanics, at its core it's about knowing your moveset and utilizing it well to overcome the challenges before you. Even under-leveled and under-geared, I can only think of 2 instances where you are gate-kept from killing an enemy by stats alone, at least off the top of my head. There are a couple of times where the game does the standard JRPG thing of introducing a boss fight you are fully expected to either lose to or simply run away from. But you can stand your ground and fight, however outmatched you are, and emerge victorious. Rarely is it ever worth doing this, but the option is there if you want to challenge yourself. As I've said before, there are a lot of systems in place for your character to grow stronger. Listing them all off would make them sound overwhelming, but they were not intrusive whatsoever when actually playing the game, mostly because they were not high maintenance. You could kind of just forget about most of them, at least until the beginning or end of a chapter, or maybe if you ran into a particularly troublesome room or boss fight, who might need a slightly different approach. The only one I care to put a spotlight on at this point is the Karen magic skills. You use weapons, shields, and armor, and they level up with time as you use them. Most of the time at max level, you'll get a new magic skill that you can equip. The system works almost exactly like the hardware system from Nier Automata, Each skill takes up a different number of slots. You have a finite number of slots, especially at the beginning, but you'll unlock more as time goes on. The idea being you might opt to take one large, stronger skill or several weaker ones. There's a good amount of variety between the skills themselves. Some might just make exploration a bit more seamless, while others will radically alter how you approach combat, such as the Berserk skill, which increases your firepower dramatically, allowing you to cleave through hordes of enemies in seconds and punch out enemies far beyond your weight class. But it comes with the drawback of making any source of damage whatsoever lethal. Just going to gush about this, but yeah, I love mechanics like this in games. Boosting your offense at the cost of defense is just cool, but it works especially well in this game where you might find other skills that complement it as well, such as a skill that increases your magic reserves at the cost of health. Doesn't really matter if you have less health if everything one-shots you anyway. Making a build in this game is intuitive because of skills like this, instead of requiring some esoteric knowledge of the systems. I think one of the most impressive things about the game is how it makes becoming stronger interesting mechanically. Of course, this is a JRPG, so you'll be godlike in power before the game is over, but it doesn't fall into the lazy approach of just making you stronger and dumping stronger enemies on you. The moveset you play around with expands dramatically, the attacks you can perform, your mobility options, the type of magic at your disposal, it all stays fresh. Magic or physical can be your primary source of damage, but it won't help you to neglect the other while you're actually in-game. Hitting things builds up the magic meter, and magic attacks make you invincible on ignition, allowing you to avoid damage while continuing your offense. The game also allows you to reallocate your stats at nearly any time, so you don't have to worry about making a bad build. It fits with the game's free approach to everything, doesn't stress you out, and encourages you to try out different things and experiment. There's also a ton of armors, weapons, and shields for you to use, all lovingly modeled onto your character. In reality, though, there are three styles: two-handed weapon, sword and board, and magic staff. I was slightly disappointed to find out weapons all share the same, or at least an extremely similar moveset, but there is real variety in the weapons between the reach, speed, and abilities associated with them. There were in fact times I went back to a weapon I had already set down for its declining stats, because it was more appropriate for the challenge at hand. Astlibra also succeeds with giving the player a decent number of defensive options. With a shield, you can block, of course. You also have a backstep with iframes to get through attacks, and again, magic gives you a spat of invincibility. All three of these options are strong, and they can all be used in conjunction with each other. Aside from a few unblockable attacks, your shield will absorb 100% of the damage from an attack, but getting your guard broken is going to hurt if you rely on it too much. Backstabbing can get you out of harm's way, but will also take you out of the action for a bit. Magic is the best option offensively, but requires a resource and usually the most timing. You can also be afflicted with status ailments through it, such as bleeding or petrification. Oh, and major kudos for actually making the shield very satisfying to use as well, something that, again, games with thousands of people working on utterly fail at. Much like the progression systems, combat is never overwhelming despite the options that you have at your disposal. One example, enemies have a health bar, as I'm sure you've grown familiar with, but they also have a break gauge. Some attacks seem to do more break damage than regular damage, and once broken, an enemy is helpless and take more damage, allowing you to run wild and dish out some major punishment. They also make a very satisfying noise when hit. The mechanic is actually somewhat reminiscent of the stagger meter from the Final Fantasy VII Remake, or the stamina break from Neo. Overall, breaking an enemy in Astlibra requires less management than either of those games, and is something you really don't need to pay much attention to until it happens. Of course, if you want to build and strategize around breaking an enemy, that's an option that you'll have as well. Otherwise, it just seems to incentivize and reward more aggressive approaches. Of course, throughout the journey, you'll be pit against all manner of foes. Slimes, skeletons, goblins, demons, dragons, and indefinite JRPG monstrosities. This game is very, very Japanese. And can I just say I really love that touching enemies doesn't hurt you in this game? I can't be the only one, but this is such a major pet peeve of mine in 2D games. It's fine for something like a Goomba who can't do anything but move, but it's ridiculous to me that an enemy with a complex moveset needs this feature as well. I'm getting a bit off topic, but yeah, there's a lot of enemies in this game. There's a great amount of enemy variety, and while they do tend to be pretty simple in design, they complement each other well. And like with all things in Astlibra, they only get more complex and better as you delve further in. Astlibra begins with a prologue that the game actually gives you the option of skipping, which I thought was a bizarre decision, even warning that it is long and there isn't any combat happening. That's fine with me, although I'm not sure it was necessary to give the player control during this segment. Narratively, I don't mind it. It's not terribly complicated of an origin story and sets the groundwork well enough. The problem is there is nothing really to do here. I don't think not having combat was the issue, but there's nothing to explore, and no additional information to be unearthed from interacting with the environment. No decisions to be made. It kind of feels like the only reason I am in control right now is because the game wants to remind me that it is in fact a video game. There actually is a choice here that ultimately amounts to, do you want to play this game or do you want to do nothing? RPGs, especially ones from Japan, are no stranger to the illusion of free choice, giving the player an option where one option leads to nothing or both options lead to the same outcome. Dragon's Quest XI has several moments where a character will ask a simple yes or no question. Refusing them will just lead to them pestering you until you say yes, but at the very least there's some humor to these scenes.
And now you are his only hope. You will help him, see? See?
You heartless monster! It's not like you're busy or anything. Help him!
Despite my issues with the intro, I wouldn't recommend skipping it. It really doesn't take that long and it will help you get into the story a bit more. From there on, the game takes on a chapter-based structure. You'll start off beating slimes with a tree branch, and before long you'll be battling a god in the heart of an active volcano. Standard stuff for a JRPG. Of course, you'll be running into other characters throughout the journey. The characters are all very likable. They aren't especially deep, although they do have more going on than you would know at first, so they aren't one note either. The interactions and banter between them is always fun. The game was written with Japanese sensibilities in mind. One might be tempted to describe the dialogue in this game as very anime. If you know what I'm talking about, you know. I understand not everyone is a fan of this stuff, and I get why. Personally, I happen to enjoy it, and I do think it is done well here for the most part. But if you're allergic to this kind of stuff in all its forms, you're probably not going to have a good time reading a lot of the dialogue in this game. These hijinks are pretty abundant throughout, and it leads to some of the most jarring shifts in tone I've ever seen. It might seem like an issue, but I think the contrast helps to make both the fun scenes and the heavy scenes more effective. The narrative has a very bittersweet feeling throughout it. I was pretty surprised at points by how far the game was willing to go. The story probably won't be loved by all, but it is, if nothing else, ambitious. It starts off with possibly the most classic tale in all of storytelling. The heroine is missing, and the hero has to find her. There are a couple of hooks to keep you invested, but nothing too hard to follow. More information comes to light, and it becomes apparent not all things are as they might seem. There were times I felt I knew with the utmost confidence exactly where the story was going, only to find new information let me know how off the mark I actually was. At some point I became fully invested and couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next. On the inverse of this, it is worth pointing out that the hero of this story isn't a full self-insert for you. He does have his own agency and priorities, and just because you realize something doesn't mean that he does. At several points in the story, you will probably know exactly what is going on, because it's blatantly obvious, but because the protagonist is a complete himbo, he doesn't have a clue, and you just have to play dumb and go along with it. Which can be a little frustrating. I did also mention that in the prologue you have a choice to make, and the choice there was completely useless. You will have to make a couple of more choices before the game is over. Fortunately, they all fare better than the one in the prologue. Some of them are mostly inconsequential, Some of them will end the game outright, leading you to a sort of alternate ending, and there is at least one choice that will have a meaningful ramification on the narrative. Some of the alternate endings are perfectly valid as stopping points to the story if for whatever reason you don't want to continue. I do wish a little more effort was put into them. They feel a bit like bad ends from a visual novel, but in terms of their place, I do actually rather enjoy them. Overall, the story is always engaging, the characters are very likable, and the game keeps a great pace. Once it feels like it's settling into a comfortable rhythm, it throws something new at you to relight your interest all over again. The mysteries all ended up having satisfying conclusions, and the big emotional payoffs landed the way that they should. At least they did for me. Between chapters, you will be sent back to the main hub. There are several shops to visit, as well as a couple of NPCs to interact with. I enjoyed hearing what everyone had to say before getting on with the main scenario. There is also an arena you can visit. New stages are available at the start of every chapter as well, giving out weapons and items. Now, I think these were intended to be done at the very end of a chapter, but I always did them at the beginning as soon as they became available, just to get ahead of upgrading weapons. That said, some of these are actually pretty tough. After you take care of whatever business you have, you'll get a new mission from your boss, Milo, and set off to a new location. You'll also get these neat chapter title cards. The chapters are usually pretty self-contained. There is an overarching story going on, but mostly you will be dealing with a more immediate issue. Think of the first Kingdom Hearts game and arriving at a new world. The game is a bit of a dungeon crawler as well, as you can't just walk into a cave, of course. You'll need to stock up on torches, healing items, pickaxes, and keys. Side note, but the way this guy uses pickaxes is really funny to me. You of course want to be stocked up before you set off, but it isn't too bad of a situation if you aren't, as there is a traveling merchant who is always in the area and will sell you the essentials. Trust me, you don't want to run out of torches in a cave. The game also has a crafting system. You can make your own torches if you don't feel like buying them, improving your healing items as well as new weapons and armor from the merchant, not from the blacksmith at the hub, for some reason. The best weapons and armor in the game are actually going to come from recipes in treasure chests dropped by enemies, so you'll want to have keys prepared as well. And to actually make those weapons and armor, you're going to need to mine material with a pickaxe. This is absolutely a game that wants you to explore as much as possible. Some of the treasure chests and items in this game are hidden very well. There is also a gacha game that you can play. You'll probably pick up small medals as you go, and you can roll from a slot machine to get prizes. It's pretty strange, but just another thing to keep your attention and to collect as you go. Nearly every chapter also has a puzzle in it. I enjoyed solving these. They have a similar line of reasoning to them you would see out of an old point-and-click adventure game. The solution is almost always usually just to backtrack and retrace your steps a bit. The way you use items, not terribly intuitive, but once you get used to it, it's not the biggest deal. It wasn't annoying to get stuck on a problem, as it meant I would wander around killing enemies and leveling my gear as I tried to work out a solution. Aside from Chapter 6, that was a bit of a pain. A couple of chapters will also contain a hidden area tucked away in them. You aren't really intended to tackle them right away. You'll find a hidden door or path. Your companions will say something to the effect of, "We shouldn't be here, we should leave right now." You ignore them because of course you will, and get killed instantly by the first enemy you see. When I first entered one of these areas, I spent 4 minutes whacking this guy over the head, only to discover that there actually are some enemies in the game that deal damage by touching you, and I was killed instantly as well. At the end of this segment, you'll come into contact with a super boss, among the strongest creatures in the world. That'll give you great rewards in the event that you actually beat them. I really don't recommend rushing this. You will have the opportunity to come back later when you're better equipped, and you may find you aren't even able to use whatever reward you get efficiently if you get it early. As you progress through the chapter, you'll have a showdown with the boss and go back home for more story. The self-contained nature of the chapters almost make them feel episodic, like you're watching a show. The game even has its own anime-style opening that plays after every single chapter, which feels slightly narcissistic to me, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. The game just has a great sense of progress, both for the story and the gameplay. I don't think I've ever played a game before that just felt like it was getting better and better the way that Astlibra does, and the Stronger Than series of achievements on Steam are a pretty fun way of looking back on how far you've come. If you're ever worried about missing out on anything, fear not, as you can travel back to any location you've been to before, between chapters, and take care of whatever unfinished business you still have. I don't think there's anything you can fully miss out on a playthrough, except for this chest for some reason. The game was, of course, made almost entirely by Kaizo. He was given help in a couple of ways. While the base character design was done by Kaizo himself, the characters were refined by Shigetaki, who lovingly brought the characters to life with his distinct style. Nearly every single character in the game has a portrait. There is also music in the game. Now, a lot of the music, I think even most of the music in the game is just free-to-use tracks that can be found on the internet. The game does have at least one copyright track, at least one original song in it, but I believe for the most part, most of the music you are going to be hearing when you play this game is stuff that can be found on the internet for free. Despite that, there has obviously been an immense amount of care in how and where each track has been used. The music is always there to complement a scene, and some of the most memorable moments in the game come from a song just playing at the right time. There's also translations, of course. Astlibra is a Japanese game. It was written in Japanese, so it's been translated to English. I actually could not find much information on the translations here, but, well, from what I can see, the translations are a little bit all over the place. For the vast majority of the time, they are absolutely fine. The occasional weirdness here or there in regards to certain item descriptions, some one-off NPCs saying something strange, just the general weirdness you get when you translate a Japanese script to English, as they are, in fact, different languages. This will probably sound a bit like copium, but this really did only add to the charm of the game for me. Having the oddball line here and there, it made me think of like an old fan sub, and it was never bad enough that I did not understand what the game was trying to communicate with me. Just some funny things here and there. I particularly love the description of this rapier. I do hear that the translation for the game used to be a lot worse and has been touched up over time. Seems like there will be further touching up done to the script, so this point might be completely moot by the time you watch this video. At the very least, at the time of writing the script, is competently translated with the occasional stiff or awkward line. Now, graphically, Astlibra Revision is not the prettiest game in the world to look at. To say I was turned off by the look at the game would be an understatement. I actually briefly considered the high praise for this game might be some sort of joke. Actually sitting down and playing it is a bit of a different experience. I don't really know what it is, but the game just looks worse when you see a screenshot or footage of it than when you actually sit down and play it for yourself. I wish I could articulate this. I'm not really sure exactly what it is. I'd just recommend seeing for yourself. The graphics didn't bother me at all when I was actually playing it. And there are moments where the visuals, well, they didn't take my breath away, but definitely left an impression on me that I dare not spoil here. That said, there are times, namely around the end of the game, where the screen becomes so cluttered with enemies and projectiles that it becomes basically impossible to tell what's even going on. Like, look at this. This is absurd, bordering on comical. How am I even supposed to tell what's happening? It's definitely understandable if the game's look is too much of a hurdle, but like I said, I would recommend giving the demo a try, just to see if it's something that actually does bother you. Let's say for the sake of brevity I've convinced you on some level. You might say something to the effect of, sure, the game has rewarding and satisfying gameplay that develops organically over the course of its impressive runtime, and it's paired with a consistently engaging story filled with lovable characters and neat interactions between them. I believe you. I also have a pretty extensive backlog I've accumulated over the years, and many of those games also have satisfying gameplay and engaging stories. What is it about this game that makes it so special? Well, I think it's time I talk about what I was getting at earlier, about the game having soul. What does that mean exactly? I'm not strictly speaking about the game not being a vehicle for microtransactions and loot boxes, or developed solely to promote some product or build up a brand, although that definitely is a factor. To me, a product having soul is about the vision that went into it, a product of passion. Astlibra caught my interest not when I first saw footage of the game itself, but when I heard the story of its creation. A single Japanese salaryman spent 14 years of his life making a game in his spare time, simply because that's what he wanted to do. Game development seems extremely bloated to me now. There are so many people who work on them, with their own contrasting visions and opinions on how things should be handled. Everything starts to fall into line a little bit. Products are made with an audience in mind rather than an idea, which certainly doesn't sound like a bad thing, but it runs the risk of muddying the creative process. Games become generic because they're essentially all aiming for the same thing, appeal to as many people as possible. Astlibra feels like a completely selfish product in comparison, made by Kaizo for Kaizo, and as a result, I find it thoroughly fascinating. It's held to his own standards of satisfaction, and was made to appeal to him before anyone else. In an interview, Kaizo said he wanted to make a game where he could relieve stress by just attacking enemies. This might seem like a comically simple goal, but yes, Kaizo, you absolutely hit it out of the park. It is hard to think of a game that makes the simple act of hitting enemies as thoroughly satisfying as Astlibra does. This is why I have trouble taking some of the criticism I've seen on this game seriously, that it would just be so much better if there was less of the perverted dialogue. The way I see it, Astlibra is great because Kaizo was willing to put so much of himself into it, not in spite of that. You can't have one without the other, and asking for the product to change to appeal to a wider audience is missing the point. It wasn't made for them, it was made for him. At least that's how I see it. And that's what I mean when I say soul. There's real passion behind the project. It feels like there was love put into every detail of the game. I recommend Astlibra to anyone who plays video games in their spare time, but I would most recommend it to someone who feels disillusioned with the state of gaming in general. If you feel the sentiment of they don't make games like X anymore, I definitely think it's worth a look. The game is available on Steam for $25. I believe a Switch port is also slated for this year. I imagine the game can run on just about any computer. The game is also listed as Steam Deck compatible on the store page, but unfortunately I do not own a Steam Deck, so I cannot verify that information for myself. It is well worth the price point when you consider how filled to the brim with content it is, but I imagine the game will regularly go on sale as well. There's also a demo on Steam. I don't think the demo is amazing in terms of showing off the appeal of the game, but it's worth a look if nothing else. If you're still unconvinced, I'm certain there are also other websites that I'm sure will offer a much better discount if you're willing to look around a bit. To speak a bit more frankly, I absolutely adore this game. I love everything about this game. It's bold, it's fresh, it's exciting. It's fun. Do you remember when games were just fun? No ifs, ands, or buts? Astlibra is a product of pure passion. You can feel that passion during every moment of the game. At its worst, it's endearing, and at its best, it's an absolute masterpiece. I don't know if we're ever going to see a product from Kaizo again. I certainly hope so, even if it does take another 14 years, but even if we never do, I think he's already left his mark with this wonderful title.